this morning for the opportunity to worship together. We give to you. We thank you for these who have made the effort to be here this morning. We pray for safety as they travel home today. But I pray that you bless each gift and each giver. Bless the time that we spend together. For in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Please be seated.
And God, on this slushy morning, God, we love you. And we're ready and excited to worship you and see what you have for us. God, I pray that you'll bless us so that we may return to your kingdom. God, we love you so much. And it's in your holy, precious name we do pray. Amen.
Well, we sang Joy to the World this morning, but for many people, Christmas brings more stress to the world than joy. There is buying and charging and wrapping and partying. There is more stress at Christmas, maybe especially with the winter weather. What about the lonely, those who have lost a loved one? There's more stress for them. Christmas even shows up on the stress chart. Have you ever seen the stress chart? It's found in your bulletin on the back of your sermon notes. This is technically called the Social Readjustment Rating Scale. It was developed by Dr. Thomas Holmes, and he attempts to quantify and rate the most stress-inducing changes in our lives. These stress scores are measured in LCUs, called life change units. We don't like change. And these are the things that bring stress to our lives, rated by Dr. Holmes and psychologists. If you accumulate 200 or more of these in a short period of time, you are said to be in great stress, at great risk, in emotional instability, losing your physical well-being. Notice some of the top 43 things, like number 1, death of a spouse. Number 2, divorce, 73 points. Marital separation, right there at 65. Above number 4, jail term. Number 8, fired at work. 24, trouble with in-laws. Notice what makes the list. Number 42, right near the bottom, but still stress-inducing, the Christmas season, 12 points. So take this home and see how many points you've got, and somehow figure out if you are in stress. But notice it is not just our modern, excessive, materialistic Christmas that causes stress. If you go back to the first Christmas and Joseph and Mary, let's look at their stress chart. You think they would be over 200 points? As I look at them, they've got marital separation, they did, 65 points. Then a reconciliation, which is also 45 points. There's a pregnancy, and I guess you get extra points for a virgin birth pregnancy. There's a change in financial state, 38 points. There's a change in living conditions, 25 points. A change in residence, they're now in Bethlehem. They're at 233 points, even before you count in-law problems. I want you to notice something on this chart. How many of them have to do with finances? How many of these things have negative financial impact? I count 21, just about half of them. So Christmas, which is on the list, causes some of these other things, which means many of us might have stressed budgets at the holidays. Joseph and Mary's budget was strained by taxes, by missing work, and by the birth of a child. But did you know that the Christmas story contains clear evidence that Jesus' parents, Joseph and Mary, were poor? Join me in Luke 2:22. Luke 2:22, our text for today. This is after the shepherds and the wise men have left. This is after the child's circumcision on the 8th day, where we left off in verse 21. But in verse 22, when the days of her purification, according to the law of Moses, were completed, a woman was ritually unclean after childbirth. They had to wait. Now, after the days were completed, they brought him, Jesus, to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who opens a womb shall be called holy to the Lord. So understand, in Israel, the firstborn belonged to God. Every firstborn had to become a priest. But in order to cover the firstborn, you would redeem that one, so the Levites would take their place, but you had to pay the price, which was 5 shekels. And in verse 24, Notice, it required offering. They offered a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Now there it was. Do you see it? The clear evidence of their poverty? It's kind of hard to see it, right? You have to look back at the law. In Leviticus chapter 12, you'll see the law there fulfilled. In Leviticus chapter 12, verse 2. If a woman has conceived and born a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. Remember, the wise men came and visited them in a house. Why were they in a house? Because Joseph didn't leave them in a stable for at least this week. He's not going to go home. He's already in Bethlehem, which is 6 miles from Jerusalem. They have to dedicate Jesus. So they stay there in town. They're in a house, at least within 8 days. And verse 6. When the days of her purification are fulfilled, that could be as many as a month, she shall bring a priest a lamb of the first year as a burnt offering. But in verse 8, if she is not able to bring a lamb, if you're too poor to be able to afford a whole lamb, then she may bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. 2 turtle doves. What did they bring? 2 turtle doves and no partridge in a pear tree. Do you wonder where 2 turtle doves come from? There's a little urban legend going around the internet that says the 12 days of Christmas are a subtle way of teaching Christian doctrine. That's not actually true. But I suspect the 2 turtle doves do come from the story. If it doesn't, it should. Here's the point. Joseph and Mary were given the choice. Bring a lamb if you can't afford it. If you're poor, bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and that's what they brought. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9, we're told, though he was rich, he became poor for your sake. Not only was he poor in leaving heaven and coming down in a human body, but he came to a poor family. Now last week I made a point of saying God could have put Jesus just in the womb of a woman who was unmarried, but God thought the importance of the nuclear family was so important, an intact family, he gave Jesus a human father as well as a human mother, although he wasn't his biological father. But the father and mother that God chose were poor. And God's son didn't come with an expense account. God sent his son, but Joseph and Mary didn't get any money as a result of it. So they had to face additional stress on their budget. Look at verse 27. Luke 2:27. When the parents, time to meet the parents, right, brought in the child Jesus according to the custom of the law, Simeon took him in his arms and blessed God and said, remember this is the blessing that Simeon gave, verse 35. Behold, the child is destined for the fall and rising of many in Israel. Yes, he looked then at Mary and said, a sword will pierce through your own soul also. Wow. Imagine we're having an infant dedication up here this morning. We don't do infant baptisms, but we do dedications. And someone has a newborn baby, and they bring him to dedicate him. And I take the baby, and I look in mom's eyes and say, this child is going to break your heart. Well, it's true, right? You have a child, they're going to break your heart. But this child's going to be the death of you. Well, that would be pretty bad, wouldn't it? But that's what Simeon does. The blessing turns into somewhat of a curse. It's a dramatic moment. But he says, a sword will pierce through your soul. And he was right, wasn't he? Yes, there would continue to be rumors about Jesus' birth. And then she would bury Joseph. And then she would bury Jesus. Now, we saw last week that Joseph and Mary emerged victorious from a marital crisis, an unplanned pregnancy, suspected infidelity, intended divorce. But had they jumped out of the frying pan into the fire, now they are going to be in not only emotional stress, but financial stress. Remember last week we defined stress as a God-given good thing like emotions, a short-term inner response to an outer stimulus that mobilizes us for change. But we think of it mainly as, secondly, a destructive force on the body caused by excessive or prolonged levels of unresolved excitement. Do you think Joseph and Mary had to deal with this kind of stress in their lives, not just to make ends meet, but to raise this very special family. I want this morning just to look at Joseph and Mary and learn from them how to deal with a stress budget, especially at Christmas. The first stress reducer I see evidence of in Joseph and Mary is careful planning. I know we have fun sometimes at Joseph's expense. Joseph forgot to call ahead and make reservations for a place to stay. Can you imagine that car ride on the way to Bethlehem? And Mary is complaining about, it's too cold or it's too hot. And of course, he looks at her and she's got the only heated seat. She's sitting on the donkey, right? And then she says, where are we going to spend the night? And he goes, oh, that's right. He forgot to get a place. But the point is, he did make arrangements and he got a place. But I guarantee it was only for one night. Yeah, the shepherds came that first night. But then Joseph got busy and he found living quarters for her. We know that because the wise men found them in a house, not in a stable. So they had to wait the 40 days, and by the time the wise men came, they found just the baby and his mother. Where was Joseph? He was at work. And I think Joseph showed some careful planning. They were in an inn in Luke chapter 2, verse 7. He found a place. But then after that, he found a house. And to find a house, he had to have the first and second month's rent, right? He had to turn on the utilities, the electricity, the phone, and the internet. Joseph had to have a plan. I think it's important for all of us, especially if you have a stressed budget, but even if you don't, to honor God by planning our spending. What is the opposite of planned spending? Unplanned spending, right? And so we learn in the Bible that budgeting is important. Jesus assumes this in Luke 14, verse 28. He says, for which of you intending to build a tower, or build a house, build anything, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? So you plan before you do something, you sit down first. Then you plan specifically, you count the cost, and then you work the plan, you finish it. You see, failing to plan is planning to fail. I don't believe this is optional. We are stewards of someone else's money, right? Do you remember the story of the three stewards? One's given 5, one's given 2, one's given 1 talent. Most of us, compared to the rest of the world, are 5-talent people. We don't think we're rich, but ask anyone else anywhere else in the world, and the poorest of us are pretty rich. But whose money is it anyway? When the master came back, he asked for a report of how they spent his money. How much of your money is really God's money? We're supposed to acknowledge it when we give our tithes and offerings. It's all his, right? He lets us keep 90% of it. But we are responsible to give receipts. You know, I spend the church's money a lot, but every time I do, I have to go back to the office and get Joyce receipts. If I don't, I'm in trouble. I'm spending the church's money, but it's all God's money, and when I spend my money, it's really God's. So God has a preference for doing things decently and in order, 1 Corinthians 14:40. So he wants us to plan our spending. It's not only mandatory, it's beneficial. Let me give you some reasons why it is beneficial. Making a budget prioritizes our spending, first things first. Most must do, should do, can do. And it also controls our spending. We've got to get control of our spending, otherwise we won't have any money to spend. It is so much better to plan out where our money is going to go, where God's money is going to go beforehand, than to try and figure out where it went after it's all gone. It helps us establish goals. It helps us eliminate waste. It encourages saving. You can only save if you plan first. It enables giving. You can't give what you don't have. It eliminates worry. You want stress in your life? A budget will not cause more stress. It will relieve stress. And it maximizes your resources. Make the most of what God has given you, what you have, by obeying God. There is one more. It is not just all those benefits, but it is obeying God. With all those benefits, you'd think we'd all sign up for this. But you know what current statistics tell us? What percentage of Americans have a budget? I asked my wife this week. She got within 1%. She's amazing. The percentage of Americans who actually have a budget? 13%. 87% of us live on disciplined financial lives and just spend the money as soon as we have it. Sometimes we don't have it, so we just charge it. So here is how to have a budget. A, count it out. First of all, you got to know how much you have. Proverbs 27:23 says, "Be diligent to know the state of your flocks." How much do you have? What's your income going to be for the month? What are your expenses for the month? If you don't write it down, if you don't count it out, you can't even begin. Then B, figure it out. Make a plan. Know how much you have and how much you have to pay for all your must-do things. And then figure it out. Proverbs also says, 21:5, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to plenty." You want a surplus? You don't want to go into debt? You want to have some saving? You want plenty? Count it out, figure it out, and then see. I think the most important part is to write it out. Remember I said 13% of us actually have a budget? 10%, 10 out of the 13, have the budget in their head. Only 3% write it out. Write it out. It's important to write things down. Luke says in chapter 1, verse 3, "It seemed good to me to write to you." Aren't you glad Luke wrote it out? We didn't depend on a long line, 2,000-year, pass it down the line. You ever play pass it down the line? Things get corrupted pretty quickly, right? Write it down. Be specific. The palest ink is better than the strongest memory. It is a matter of commitment. Write it down. And then the key, D, live it out. You don't keep it slavishly. It's a guideline. Remember, it's like the Sabbath. The Sabbath is made for us, not us for the Sabbath. What did the Jews do with the Sabbath? They made it into chains to tie them down. We are to make up a budget, but we make up the budget. We can change it if we need to. But if you change it, write it down. Live it out. 1 Timothy 6:17 says he gives us richly all things to enjoy. He doesn't want us to begrudgingly have to pinch pennies. He wants us to enjoy the things that he gives us. But it's so much easier to enjoy when you're not charging it. When you are saving up for it, you can spend it with joy. I know some people will say, "Pastor, you just added more stress to my life. I've got to make a budget." No. I'm telling you, it is not a stress cause. Actually, the lack of financial planning increases stress. A budget will reduce stress. In Matthew 6:33, Jesus said, "Seek first the kingdom of God." How do you put it first? Prioritize your spending. Do not worry about tomorrow. How do you not worry about tomorrow? By planning your spending. You need help? Count it out, figure it out, write it out, and live it out. Second stress reducer I see evidence of in Joseph and Mary's life is hard work. Remember Jesus said in Luke 2:49, "I must be about my Father's business." He was not slamming Joseph, saying, he's an unemployed bum. No, his father's business was carpentry. Jesus was a carpenter. His dad was a carpenter, Matthew 13:55. He taught Jesus to be a carpenter. He gave Jesus a trade, and Jesus was a carpenter up until the age he was 30. Mark chapter 6, verse 3. But then he left that, and he got a new job as a minister. But when the wise men came, where was this hard-working carpenter? He was out doing a job somewhere. Because in Matthew 2:11, they found the young child with Mary, his mother. I know work sounds like a dirty four-letter word to some people today, but the Bible says work is not the result of the fall. Adam and Eve had work in the garden before sin came to the world, right? It's a good thing. In 2 Thessalonians 3:10, Paul says, "If anyone will not work, if you can work, neither shall he eat." Hunger is a great motivator. And the principles there already quoted this morning, Galatians 6:7, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. He is a foolish man indeed, who doesn't plant anything and then goes out in the fields and wonders where the crops are. Crops only come if you plant them and water them and weed them, and then you have to reap them, and then you have to grind it into flour to make bread. This is not a result of the fall. It is but what we were made to do. God works. He rests because he works. He expects us to work. It's what we were made to do. Luke chapter 14, verse 3, Jesus says about the Sabbath, there are 6 days on which men ought to work. We were built to work. What happens to a machine that's not used? What happens to a car that's not used for a year? It's not going to run very well, right? We were made to work. Now, if you are retired, congratulations. Good for you. But what will you do with yourself? You were made to work. Will you sit with your feet in the sand? Don't retire from God's service. 1 Thessalonians 4:11 says, aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your own hands. Work, more stress, hogwash. Actually, hard work and exercise decrease stress. Exercise and hard work are stress reducers, and we see that in the life of Joseph and Mary. And the third stress reducer I see evidence of in Joseph and Mary is limited spending. To balance a budget, you can do one of two things. You can increase your earning, go get a second or third or fourth job. Or you can decrease your expenses. Which is easier? It's always easier to decrease your expenses, right? You only have so many hours in a week. Is there evidence of this in Joseph and Mary's doing without? Sure. Mary's pregnant. She needs a place to stay. So what do? Whip out some plastic? Finance a pricey spa? No. In Luke chapter 1, she went and stayed with relatives. She remained with Elizabeth about 3 months. This is what we do, right? If we're trying to save money, we don't get a pricey hotel. We go someplace and we stay with relatives. How about feeding the 5,000? What did Jesus do? Go out and charge it? Withdraw from savings? Get a second mortgage? Have a fundraiser? No. Limited spending. When he performed his first miracle, what did he do? He turned the water into wine, rather than going out and spending lavishly. He didn't say, go down in my wine cellar. We see limited spending is taught in Proverbs. It's so wise. Proverbs 21:20. There is desirable treasure and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but the foolish man squanders it. Spends it all, then wonders where it all went. You know what the average American will make and spend in an average lifetime? You know how much money will pass through your hands in a lifetime? Think about it. $2 million. $2 million, not me! You say, wait a minute. If you make $20,000 a year for 50 years, that's $1 million. They're saying we probably make, on the average, more than $20,000 a year. So if the average income in America is more like $40,000, that's $2 million in a lifetime. Where will it all go? What if God asked you for receipts for that $2 million? Well, I told my wife this week, I know where 1/10 of it went. That's good. Matthew 6:19, Jesus says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Jesus warns us against the rat race, the belief that he who dies with the most toys wins. Nonsense. He who dies with the most toys still dies. Doesn't mean you have to give it all away, like Jesus told the rich young ruler in Matthew 19. You give it all away, and then you'll be poor, and you'll need somebody else to take care of you. But we must limit our spending somehow, right? What's a good number to cut it off at? Well, 100% of what you make. How about 90% or 80% of what you make? Another way we can limit our spending is by learning contentment. 1 Timothy 6:8. Having food and clothing, Paul says, with these we shall be content. I want to define a word for you that you use quite often, but most of us have no clue what it means. It's the word rich. You know what rich means? Rich, for almost all of us, means 10% more. What somebody else has, more than I have. Having been in not just second world countries, but in third world countries, visiting the Amazon, where I visited a family whose entire rural savings, all they had, was one pot and a thatched grass house. That was all they owned, and the loincloth they had on. How much is rich? Here's the definition of rich in 2 words. Having enough. Isn't that what 1 Timothy 6:8 says? If you have enough, you're richer than half the world, right? Half the world doesn't have enough. Success may be getting what you want, But contentment is wanting what you have. Getting what you want can be tough, but wanting what you have is pretty easy. You can do that right now. You can do that today. And I'm here to tell you, if you are not satisfied with what you have now, you will never be satisfied with what you have, no matter how much more you get. Some say, well, it's easy for you to say, Pastor. You live in a nice house, and you have good income, and you don't know the trouble I'm going through. My wife and I have learned the lesson of having $15 a week for groceries when we started. We have learned to do without. We have learned to be satisfied with what God has given us. Because if we're not satisfied with what God has given us, then we're being disobedient to the Lord. I learned this lesson from a true story I read years ago by Keith and Sharon. He had a lifelong dream of hiking the Appalachian Trail. And he was busy in seminary studying to go into ministry, and they were young and they had a lot of things to do. They couldn't go on this Appalachian Trail journey of 1,000 miles. Hiking for me, 1 mile is a long time. Hike 1,000 miles, that's a pretty big hike. But after he finished seminary, before he started his first job, they had a few months. And so they went down to Georgia, where the trail begins, and they started. They packed wisely. They both had clothes on their back and one backpack. And so they began to think, prioritizing, what do we need? What is really enough? And so they packed all the stuff they thought they would need. She wanted her moccasins, because after a long day of hiking, she wanted something comfortable for feet, not hiking boots. And she packed her little transistor radio so she could keep in contact with the world outside. And she said, I had to take the necessary things like my makeup kit. I wanted to look good as possible out there. When they got everything they needed, including food and something to cook with, he had a 50-pound pack, and she had about 40 pounds, and that was pretty good. And so they set out in March. And then they said the euphoria wore off pretty quickly. The Appalachian Trail evidently is all uphill. Well, that's possible, they said, but it sure seemed like it to them. Every day they would trudge, and then they would collapse into their sleeping bags, too tired to even cook dinner. It was cold and snowy, and they were miserable, and they thought, how can things get worse? Then winter stopped, and it got worse because the spring rain started. And so they would trudge all day. Instead of breaking for 10 minutes every hour, now they would break every hour for about an hour, and their feet were sore, and their backs were sore, and they were so tired that they would just trudge along, looking at the path in front of them, not to trip on the rocks, not even taking the short little route to cut off of the main trail to get the beautiful scenery. That's what they came for, was the scenery, but it was cold and it was drizzly, and so they would get to the lean-to that they had to get to at the end of the day where they could sleep. And they would be cold and wet, and they would take off their wet clothes, and in the morning when they got up all stiff and sore, their clothes were still just as wet as before, and they were miserable. And he actually said, the one whose dream it was, what in the world are we doing this for? She smiled around. He said, for the scenery, obviously. They came to an end of themselves after about a month, and they said they learned the secret of joyful backpacking. They took everything out of their backpacks that were making them miserable, and they said, what can we do without? What do we really need? Well, she thought, these moccasins are really nice, but I'm not really getting to use them. And so she left them in the lean-to for the next person. And this transistor radio, who cares what's going on out there? And they started getting rid of stuff and taking the food out of the packing, and then she took out her makeup and said, no, I really need that. She kept that. And they had a bonfire, and they burned the stuff that they didn't need, the packaging, and they left the necessities behind for somebody else to carry, and they got their packs down to 18 pounds for him and 12 pounds for her, and they learned this very important lesson I want you to learn today. The lighter the load, the greater the joy. Say that with me. The lighter the load, the greater the joy. My wife and I have moved 4 times. One time we moved from our honeymoon in a tiny little U-Haul to Georgia. And then in just 2 years from Georgia, to New Jersey, we had a truck that we couldn't fit all our stuff in, so I had to make 2 trips from Georgia to New Jersey. It was a lot of stuff to gain in 2 years. Then after 20 years in New Jersey, we moved from New Jersey to Maryland, and we couldn't fit all our stuff in a great big truck, a whale semi-tractor trailer. And then a year and a half ago, we moved to North Carolina, and we needed 3 trucks to move it all. Well, 4 actually, when you count, I brought down a truck of books, 20,000 of them. And you know what? Every time we've moved, we said, you know what? We got to get rid of some of this stuff. And we just said this week, the next time we move, hopefully it's heaven, but if we ever move again, we're not moving all this stuff. The lighter the load, the greater the joy is the secret of backpacking, but isn't it the joy of life? The more stuff you have, the more stuff you have to worry about. It's not stressful to get rid of stuff. Actually, it is stressful to have too much stuff. One last thing.